After breakfast, the mentor and apprentice headed out into the wilderness. They quickly arrived at a trap site. Maddie's first lesson was on setting a simple trap, typically used for hunting. The method is straightforward. Use branches to build a triangular space under a tree, place the bait at the back, follow with a trap covered by snow. If an animal goes for the bait, it's sure to get caught in the trap. After setting the trap, they moved to the next site. Next, Maddie taught how to set a mink trap. First, tie a log at an angle to a big tree. Put the bait at the top of the log, with the trap right behind it. If a marten goes for the bait, it must step on the trap. Andy listened very carefully, quickly absorbing everything Maddie taught. It won't be long before Andy is ready to go it alone. With Andy's help, Maddie felt twice as confident. To make the most of Andy's free labor, he planned to build another hunting cabin on the other side of the hunting area. This would save them a lot of time traveling back and forth. Upon hearing this, Andy felt a wave of shock, thinking Maddie was really not holding back. What will Maddie do next with his free apprentice? Let's wait and see. Since taking on an apprentice, Maddie has been like a man possessed. He spends his time either setting traps with Andy or expanding their territory. Now, on top of the original hunting lines, Maddie has extended them by 15 kilometers, really squeezing every bit of work out of Andy. After a few days of learning, Andy has basically mastered what Maddie taught. Today, he will test what Andy has learned over the past few days. He specifically designated a hunting line for Andy to manage on his own. If Andy can handle it all, it will greatly improve Maddie's efficiency in checking traps. It's safe to say he played his cards well. Then, the two split up. Maddie drove his snowmobile in one direction, leaving Andy to fend for himself in the windy wilderness. Andy's route was 6 kilometers long. Not too long, but not short either. He tightened his snow boots and strode forward confidently. Maddie had his own ideas about how to teach Andy. In this harsh land, loneliness and solitude are constant companions. Their biggest enemies are not wild beasts, but the loneliness and fear within. As a qualified Alaskan fur hunter, if he can't face solitude and fear, he's not cut out to be a hunter. This is what Maddie hoped Andy would come to understand on his own. The wilderness was thick with snow. Andy struggled to the first trap, which, unfortunately, was empty. Though he didn't catch anything, Andy dutifully cleared the snow off it. But the rookie actually used his hand to check the trap, thankfully only catching his glove. After resetting the trap, Andy moved on to the next location. This trap was meant for catching bobcats, but it was also empty. Several traps in a row turned up empty, which was somewhat disheartening for the newbie. But that's hunting for you. Not every trap is going to catch something. It's mostly up to whether nature feels like giving. So, Andy headed to the next station with hope. This time, luck was on his side. A pine marten was caught in the trap. Andy instantly smiled with joy. This was his first catch checking traps alone, a significant milestone for him. He then carefully followed Maddie's instructions to remove the catch and pack it neatly in his backpack. The day quickly passed, and it gradually got darker. Andy arrived at the designated meeting spot to wait for Maddie. However, after an hour or two, it was completely dark, and Maddie still hadn't shown up. Andy started to worry. Was his master not waiting for him and had gone back alone? Anxiety swirled in his mind. As time ticked by, the temperature kept dropping. Soon, Andy couldn't stand the cold anymore and decided not to wait any longer. He planned to walk back on his own. But the Alaskan night is very dangerous, often accompanied by the howling of wolves. This made the already anxious Andy even more unsettled. Fortunately, it wasn't long before Maddie caught up from behind. Andy finally relaxed. Was Maddie late on purpose to let Andy experience the loneliness and solitude of the wilderness? What do you think? Tom is a master at trapping beavers. Every year at this time, he roams around ponds where beavers are known to be, setting traps to catch plump beavers. Today, Tom was making handicrafts when a relative he hadn't seen in years suddenly visited. The visitor was Tom's grandson, Tanner. The grandfather and grandson hadn't seen each other for 3 years. Seeing his grandson, Tom was naturally overjoyed. Holding Tanner's hand, Tom talked about the fun of living in the wilderness, which is completely different from city life. Tanner had just arrived and was really curious about the outside world. Tom noticed his restless spirit and decided to take this chance to really challenge him. Even though Tanner was here on vacation, the old man wasn't going to coddle him. He immediately assigned him a task: to clear the snow off the roof to lighten its load. Tanner was clearly not pleased. After all, he was here to vacation, not to work. But he didn't dare disobey his grandfather, so he reluctantly picked up the tools and started working. From his red, frustrated face, you could tell Tanner was feeling pretty stifled. Meanwhile, Tom and Nancy were hiding on the side, chuckling to themselves. After the snow was cleared, Tom planned to take Tanner out for some excitement. Not long ago, Tom had set some hunting traps, and now it was time to check them. Soon, they drove to the site. In front of them was a stream nearly buried by heavy snow. Although mostly frozen over, the ice was still thin. Walking on it, they could hear the ice crackling underfoot. For Tanner, all of this was thrilling and new, and he gradually began to enjoy the adventure. At first, he carefully followed behind Tom, but it wasn't long before he became recklessly bold. Next thing, he found himself covered in snow. Initially, Tanner didn't understand why Tom loved this lifestyle, but after going hunting with him, his views dramatically changed. He became increasingly interested in wilderness living. Soon, they reached the first trap, but unfortunately, it was empty. However, this was no big deal. Tom took this opportunity to teach Tanner some trap-setting skills. Then, Tom had Tanner take out fresh bait from the backpack and started explaining how to set up the trap. Tanner was naturally very happy about handling fresh food. Now, they were off to the next location. As the snowmobile sped along, the grandfather and grandson arrived at a pond. Here, Tom had set traps to catch beavers. Unexpectedly, the first trap had caught a huge beaver, weighing at least 40 pounds. Beaver meat is not only tasty, but its fur can also be sold for money. Tom claimed that with his unique processing, this beaver was worth $300. Tom was in a great mood about this. Seeing his grandfather's joy at the catch, Tanner started to understand why his granddad loved the wilderness life. After all, who would give up city life if not for a true passion? With Andy successfully passing Maddie's test, the two returned to the hunting cabin and immediately began processing the day's catch. Their goal was to preserve the fur better, while Maddie took this time to teach Andy how to skin properly. As a qualified fur hunter, you need to not only set traps well, but also process the fur expertly. After all, expert handling can multiply the price of an ordinary fur several times over. Andy was very serious about learning. He then tested what he had just learned. And with that, Andy graduated. Tomorrow, he will leave this place with all these valuable experiences. Andy is extremely grateful to Mr. Maddie for sharing his knowledge so generously, from setting traps to harvesting game, from processing fur to producing finished fur products, from a timid boy to a man with a strong heart. Andy's gratitude to his mentor is beyond words. All good things must come to an end. After sending his apprentice away, Maddie returned to his solitary life. So far, Maddie has completed 40% of his fur target. It's safe to say his hunting season has been quite lucky. If the days ahead are just as smooth, Maddie will surpass his target of 450 furs. However, he now faces a problem. His supplies are running low. Although he catches game every day, the animals are too lean and don't provide enough energy. So, Maddie is considering hunting an elk. He's very familiar with the wilderness in northern Alaska and knows a few places where elk are often found. But in winter, food is scarce, and the elk are always on the move. Tracking them down is not easy. Also, today is the last day of the elk hunting season. If Maddie doesn't make a catch today, he'll have to find another solution. Luckily, fortune still favors him. Not long after setting out, he finds elk tracks. He follows the tracks eagerly, but the sight that meets his eyes is chilling. An elk skeleton, picked clean, so clean even a fly would cry if it saw it. From the traces, it was clearly the work of wolves. What angers Maddie is that the wolves left nothing behind, not even a hair. Knowing he's a fur hunter, this feels like an insult from the wolves. Due to the time crunch, Maddie sets aside the idea of dealing with the wolf pack for now. He needs to quickly find his prey. And it must be said, his luck today is truly good. After traveling a bit further, he finds another set of elk tracks. Since elk are naturally skittish and would vanish at the sound of a snowmobile, Maddie decides to proceed on foot for better tracking. 3 miles later, Maddie finally catches up with the big fellow. Now at the perfect shooting distance, Maddie raises his rifle without hesitation. After the gunshot, Maddie took down the massive elk. Looking at its size, you could say it was huge. Now with this elk, Maddie won't have to worry about food for a while. Soon, it got dark. Because the temperatures drop too low at night and visibility is poor, Maddie could only do a basic processing of the elk, planning to transport it home when it gets light the next day. He just prayed wolves wouldn't find it overnight. The next day came quickly. Maddie arrived early at the spot where he left the elk. Seeing the elk meat intact, Maddie's heart finally settled. Then he started moving the meat. It felt really great. Makes you want to ask if he needs another apprentice. Anyone else feeling like learning from him? Recently, Tom set up a lot of muskrat traps along the riverbank, planning to use the muskrat fur to make traditional hats. Because the process involves boating, and Tom is getting older, moving around isn't as easy for him alone. So Will planned to help Tom out while fishing. Of course, he had his own little motive: to score a muskrat hat for himself after the work was done. But today's weather doesn't look too good. Just as they loaded the boat on the car, the sky started dropping heavy snow. Looking at the scale of the snowfall, it's likely to bring about 30 centimeters of snow. Also, this kind of weather can cause a significant drop in temperature. Clearly, it's not suitable to go out. But if the traps aren't retrieved and they get frozen over, Tom's plan to make muskrat hats would be ruined. It looks like Tom needs to hurry and secure the boat properly. The two then drove to their destination. Muskrats, also known as marsh otters and muskrats, are named for the glandular secretions near their perineum, which smell similar to musk. Since they live in water and are good swimmers, they're also called water rats. As the snow fell heavier, Tom and his companion needed to speed up. After setting the boat, they slid down the river to the traps. Perhaps because of the snow, the river was flowing faster than usual, which actually sped up their journey. Soon, they arrived at the first trap, where they could see the catch floating on the water surface. Clearly, this was a great start. The next trap also successfully caught one, which really delighted Tom. But this was just the beginning. The third trap also had a catch. Tom was so happy. He was almost drooling. Then they moved on to the fourth trap, and sure enough, there was another big catch in there. However, this trap was poorly positioned, requiring them to get out of the boat to retrieve it. Will got the hint and jumped into the river to get the trap. Looking at the catch in his hands, Will couldn't help but praise Tom's expert trap setting. With this, Tom had hit 4 in a row. But just as they were basking in the joy of a good harvest, an accident happened. Due to slippery rocks at the river bottom, Will slipped and fell into the river. This was really bad. With heavy snow falling and temperatures dropping fast, Will was soaked. And if he didn't change his clothes soon, he could get hypothermia, which could be life-threatening. They had to head back immediately. After some effort, they safely returned to Tom's house. After a night of recovery, Will was finally out of danger. In the morning, they drank hot coffee. They laughed about yesterday's thrilling scene, as if the danger was nothing new to them. But when you think about it, it makes sense, because this is just the reality of life in the mountains. This winter hunting season, Maddie's luck has been the best ever. In just over 2 months, he has already achieved 60% of his target. If he completes the remaining 40%, then Maddie will easily meet his goal of 450 furs this year. Looking at the furs spread across the table, Maddie is feeling really confident. But he can't relax even a bit, because there are too many unknowns out here. Last winter, he only made $4,000. Not only did he not make much money, he almost lost his savings. So, learning from last winter's lessons, Maddie is making the most of every minute here, trying to catch as much game as possible. Each day, as soon as it gets light, Maddie heads out into the wilderness to expand his hunting lines. Today, Maddie plans to set some single animal traps. These traps are for catching a type of medium-sized fierce animal whose fur is even more valuable than pine marten. They are what every fur hunter dreams of, but they are not easy to catch. To increase his chances, Maddie has to set several traps in the areas they frequent. Soon, the traps are all set. Now, he just prays for a big haul tomorrow. With the new day, Maddie heads out early to the traps he set yesterday. You can't stop good luck when it's on your side. He reached the first trap, and it had a catch, but the game was buried under heavy snow. Maddie wasn't sure until he cleared the snow. Turns out, it was a pine marten. A great start. Although it wasn't exactly what he was aiming for, Maddie believed he would catch one. Then he moved on to the next trap. Sure enough, there was another one in that trap. Today was turning out to be a great day for Maddie, but he didn't spend too much time celebrating. He quickly moved on to the next trap. After all, daylight hours are few, and he needed to make the most of the time. As time ticked by, and he finished checking the lines, it started to get dark. Just when he was about to call it a day, luck favored him again. He caught a second one. Catching one would have satisfied Maddie, but catching two made his day. Now it was getting late, and Maddie could finally go home fully satisfied. Guess what? Do you think he hummed a tune all the way back? In the Rocky Mountains of Montana, Tom aggravated an old knee injury on a trip outside. So, he's been resting at home for a while. But he hasn't been idle during his recovery. He's planning to use this downtime to make some extra handicrafts. Recently, he received an order to make a sheath for a river knife. But during the process, he discovered he was running low on supplies. So, Tom planned to check the traps despite his injury. However, Nancy adamantly opposed this. She insisted that Tom rest at home and said she would take care of the traps herself. You might not know, but although they've lived here for over 30 years, Tom always treats Nancy like a princess. She neither sets traps nor uses hunting rifles. Even though Nancy has often asked Tom to teach her, he has always refused, saying it's too dangerous. Right now, Tom couldn't do it himself, so he had to call his good friend Tim to come over and help Nancy out. What Tom didn't expect was that Tim was also a novice at setting traps. Of course, Tom didn't know this yet. Then they headed to the pond, and their luck wasn't too bad. Right when they arrived, they saw a plump beaver in the trap. But when they tried to lift the trap, they were clueless, because neither of them knew how to open it. After lots of trying and failing, they just gave up. Looks like this is still a job for Tom. What happened next is beyond me. They released the beaver back into the pond, then went home to ask Tom to come over. I mean, couldn't you just carry the beaver home? Why make injured Tom come all the way out there? Back at Tom's house, Tim just stood there grinning at Tom, leaving Tom completely confused. After they explained what happened, Tom immediately perked up and followed them back to the trap. Then, it was time for a lesson from Master Tom. Tom said, "First do this, then that, and then this again." And the trap just opened. Tim and Nancy were totally amazed by his skills. Old Ginger is indeed spicier. After securing the beaver, the three of them happily went home. In the wilderness of northern Alaska, today, Maddie welcomed back a familiar face, his recently trained apprentice, Andy. Is he starting his career as a fur hunter? Not exactly. He's actually been called back by Maddie to do the grunt work. As Maddie keeps expanding his hunting grounds, his days out are getting longer, leading him to come home late, which is risky in the dangerous Alaskan nights. To ensure his safety, Maddie plans to build another hunter's cabin at the other end of his hunting line, which would offer a place to rest when he's too far from home. But building a cabin is a huge task. If Maddie were to do it alone, it would severely affect his hunting progress. So, after much thought, he decided to call Andy, his free labor, to help out. After measuring the area, Andy started clearing the snow from the site, while Maddie cleared away the extra trees. With their combined effort, the site was quickly cleared. Next, it was time to start building the cabin. Fortunately, there's an abundance of timber nearby, which made things a bit easier for them. Because Maddie prioritized speed over aesthetics, the cabin's looks were somewhat lacking. You could see they used very thick logs, each weighing at least 200 pounds. Handling them was definitely a task that required caution. Any mishap in this harsh, cold land would be dreadful. Once the foundation was laid, they started building the walls. The method was simple, just stacking the logs. Since the logs weren't perfectly even, Maddie had to occasionally saw through the middle to level them. Thankfully, he had his apprentice to help stabilize the logs. Without Andy, it would have been impossible for Maddie to do it alone. Then they carved a notch in the middle of the wood and hammered a nail into it to secure the two layers of logs together. As time passed, their relentless efforts raised the wall almost 2 meters high. However, Andy was still too young to handle everything perfectly. At this point, he was starting to run out of steam. Maddie, on the other hand, was still full of energy. Clearly, Andy still has a long way to go before he becomes a qualified hunter. They worked until dark to finish up for the day. The next day came quickly, and the master and apprentice started working early. Today, they just had one last wall to finish, and then the roof, and they'd be done. Soon, they were working on the roof, but by then, Andy's hands were starting to fail him. It was clear that he was suffering from overexertion. Now he couldn't even hammer a nail straight, though he did manage to hit his own hand quite accurately. Maddie saw that Andy had really hit his limit, so he took the hammer from his hands. In no time at all, he finished the job. You've got to admit, Maddie's stamina is impressive. Now let's see what you think of the hunter's cabin they built. If you had to rate it out of 10, what score would you give it? As the temperature in the Rocky Mountains started to warm up, Tom received a call from his brother Jack. He mentioned that he has a spirited horse, now 3 years old, that he hasn't been able to tame yet. He wanted Tom's help with this challenge, because as the horse gets older, it will only become harder to tame. Tom decided to go have a look, but there's one problem. He hasn't trained a horse in 20 years, and wasn't sure he could still do it. Jack lives in a small town by the Idaho River, and after a few hours' drive, Tom arrived at Jack's place. To welcome his brother, Jack had prepared a special meal of local grouse. After a hearty meal, it was time to get to work. Horse training needs to happen in a small area to better control the horse. Otherwise, they'd just be chasing it around. First, they had to fix up a corral specifically for training horses. Then they drove the horse to be tamed into the corral, along with an older horse, to calm the young one and serve as a role model. Training a horse is no easy task, especially since both men are getting on in years. So they had to be very careful throughout the process to avoid any accidental injuries. The first step was to get the young horse under control. Once the horse calmed down, they both began to make contact with it to gain its trust. Seeing that the horse didn't resist too much, they smoothly put a bridle on it. Then Jack led it around the corral to get it used to the feeling. Training a horse is a lengthy process, and all this was just the beginning. The hardest part was next. Tom saddled the horse and carefully mounted it. To prevent any sudden outbursts, both Jack and Tom needed to control it together at first. They walked it around the corral countless times until the horse adapted to the situation. Then, seizing the moment, Tom began teaching it commands. Learning commands is a process that takes several days to complete. So for the next few days, Tom repeated the same steps daily. Fortunately, the progress over these days was very smooth. Next, it was time to test the training results in the wilderness. The horse had become very obedient, and with that, the horse training was thoroughly completed. Meanwhile, Maddie had now been in northern Alaska for 4 months. He's now completed his target of 450 furs. It's finally time to head home. But before leaving, he has one more job to do. Collect all the traps he set up to avoid accidentally harming animals during the off-season. Because he expanded his hunting area all winter, rounding up all the traps will be a long process. He's not sure how many traps he set. Somewhere between 150 and 200 by his estimate. Now, all he can do is check them one by one. Luckily, disarming the traps is pretty straightforward. Just remove the bait and close the trap. Maddie is quick with his hands, and he managed to disarm a third of them by noon. Next, he heads to another area, along Squirrel River, where he sped all winter, which provided great convenience. But his trust in it led to a harsh lesson the next second. His snowmobile got stuck deep in the slush and couldn't budge. This accident left Maddie in despair. To get the snowmobile out, Maddie cut the snow behind it, seeing the water immediately freeze on the metal. Realizing this was bad news, he quickly tried to move the snowmobile, but he was a step too late. The bottom of the snowmobile was already frozen solid, making it extremely heavy. Now, moving it was impossible. He'd have to wait for the slush to freeze solid tomorrow to try again. As the evening darkened, and with 20 kilometers to home, walking back was far too dangerous. So after some thought, Maddie decided to spend the night in the wilderness. As it got darker, the temperature dropped. He needed to get a fire going fast. Luckily, he always carried a Chinese brand lighter with him when he went out. Otherwise, by morning, he might have turned into a statue. Being in this harsh, cold land, Maddie always took ample precautions when going out, including packing a survival kit with a sleeping bag. Just put some branches between the snow and the sleeping bag, and he could have a comfortable sleep inside, surviving a tough night. The next morning, Maddie was complaining about the cold, but you've got to admit, he's pretty tough to brave a night in the wilderness. After packing up his sleeping bag, Maddie went back to the snowmobile. The slush from yesterday had completely frozen. Now, just clearing the ice off the snowmobile should free it. Maddie picked up an axe and started to chip away at the ice. He was very careful the whole time, fearing he might damage the parts frozen inside. After an hour of careful work, Maddie finally cleared all the ice. Then he tried to start it, and luckily, there were no issues. The snowmobile started up smoothly, and Maddie's heart settled. He then continued with his work, dismantling the traps. And when all the traps were disarmed, it was time to leave. He secured the cabin, then Maddie took off towards home with the entire winter's haul. As winter turns to spring, everything comes back to life, and it's the season of stirring once again. Tom was carefully processing the furs inside his house, hoping to get a good price for this winter's haul. Just then, his old friend Tim came over. There's a saying, "No one visits a temple without a cause," and Tim looked in a rush. Clearly something was up. With spring's arrival, the melting snow was quickly filling Tim's pond, and the beavers were getting restless again, building dams right at the pond's outlet. Tim was really worried, since the pond water is his family's drinking source, and the dams could lead to poor water flow and a surge in microbes and parasites. Drinking it could cause severe diarrhea and abdominal pain. Tim didn't know how to catch beavers, so he had no choice but to ask Tom for help. As decades-long friends, Tom was of course willing to help. But this time, Tom planned to teach Tim how to catch beavers himself, so he could handle this issue if it ever came up again. They headed to the pond, and Tom started his lesson with the traps. These traps are powerful, and you have to be really careful setting them up, because if it snaps on you, you'll be bandaged for at least half a month. Though Tim isn't a professional hunter, he knows a bit about traps. So after some coaching from the old hunter, he managed to set one up on his own. The old hunter was quite pleased with Tim's performance. After setting the traps, they each headed home, planning to check the beaver traps the next day. After a night's wait, Tom and Tim went together to the pond, and to their delight, there was a fat beaver in the trap, and it was the one Tim had set. For a newbie, catching prey on his first try was really lucky. They pulled the beaver ashore, and since Tim had set the trap the day before, today was a good day to hand over the traps to him. After the old hunter's careful instruction, Tim had mastered the essence of the trap, and it was like he had graduated. So, Tom gave him the traps to practice with, and they left with their prize. What Tom didn't know was that back at home alone, Nancy had received a call from their daughter, asking the old couple to come live with them in Florida. She had even booked flights without telling them first. After hanging up, Nancy relayed the message to Tom. Tom was silent after hearing it, clearly very reluctant to leave. But what their daughter said made sense. They were getting older, and it was time to enjoy some peace. He also had to consider Nancy. So, after a night of thinking it over, Tom decided to give Florida a try. He then called his good friend Will, asking him to sell the furs and handicrafts he had gathered over the winter. After handing over his affairs, the couple packed up and drove away from the place they had lived for over 30 years. And with that, the second season came to an end.